This is E&P Reports from Editor and Publisher Magazine, the authoritative voice of news media since 1884, serving newspapers, broadcasts, digital, and all multimedia news publishing. And greetings once again, Mike Blinder, publisher, E&P Magazine. Housekeeping as usual. If you are listening on a podcast platform, whatever you prefer, please follow us. Watching on our YouTube channel, there's a subscribe button below me, a bell to the right. Smash that thing. You'll get an update each and every time we upload a new episode of E&P Reports. I have Stephen Waldman with me. I may call you Steve, I believe, if that's okay. We're friends. This is your third visit. That means you've equaled Ken Doctor on this program. You get the special jacket with the logo. Steve, I have two bones to pick with you. The first one is major. I went to your Wikipedia page and I saw this tremendous background. I mean, they even have a picture of you walking on water. I mean, it talks about you being the chair of the Rebuild Local News Coalition, which we're going to talk about today, the co-founder of Report for America, working for the FCC, senior advisor, best-selling author. I mean, on founding faith, how our founding fathers forged a radical new approach to religious. It goes on and on. I think you have over 130 characters more than Mark Twain on your Wikipedia page. But it's lacking the most important thing. Nowhere in there does it say that you're a member of the E&P class of 2022, 25 over 50. So I should just shut this interview down. Oh,
you're totally right. Well, it's, you're not supposed to do it yourself. Other people are supposed to do it for you.
If someone is watching or listening to this program, please go to Wikipedia and alert them that in August of 2022, Stephen had the biggest honor of his life, being a 25 over 50 with the rest of us old fellows. The second.
But you outed me as being over 50.
And you look like you're 25. Anybody who's watching on YouTube will see that. But the second reason is in December, we at E&P were getting a lot of report about what was going on in Washington on the JCPA. We're getting a lot of, intel, but no one's on the record. Every time we're calling someone on their mobile, is this on or off the record? We're watching this thing implode. The JCPA go from the defense spending bill, then it just implodes there, and I can't get it. I'm texting and emailing everybody. I'm even going to the National Institute of Broadcasters. Should we put up the bat signal? I mean, that's what I'm screaming at E&P because we've got this huge audience. And it kind of imploded. And I started to write an editorial for our March issue saying, let's all play together. There are too many organizations. Why don't we all... I mean, in the old days, there was the news managers association, but you've got a million different people going in a million different directions. Lion wants to go in one direction. You got News Media Alliance, you got all this and more. And I was wondering, why aren't we working collectively as an industry and growing up? And I was going to write this, and then I read this press release that you just put out from a Rebuild Local News Coalition, that you have put together an organization, or whatever you want to call it, right, of leading industry associations that are now going to work for the common good. Do I have that correct, sir?
Yes, that's the idea. And very much with that spirit in mind is like we are facing an existential crisis in local news. It's a crisis not just for our businesses and industry, but for democracy and for the health of communities. And it's crazy to have all these different groups and constituencies all rowing in different directions counterproductively. So let's get together and try to build consensus around public policies that can help save local news and other causes. Now, the reality is that you're not going to get consensus around everything.
No.
And we have the Rebuild Local News organization, which just launched this month, grew out of an informal coalition that's been around for a couple of years by the same name that had been incubated under Report for America. And we were able to get consensus around almost every issue. The one exception was the JCPA.
The JCPA.
That was the one that the groups in our coalition were divided. And so our coalition ended up being neutral about it because some of the groups strongly supported it, some of it opposed it, some were kind of in the middle. And so we, as a group, we just said, you all go advocate as you will. But yeah, it's unfortunate that we can't, achieve more consensus on all of the big things.
Well, let's talk about how we get everybody to play in the same sandbox, if I may, as we talk about the Rebuild Local News Coalition with Steve Waldman on the backside of this message.
This episode of E&P Reports is sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide are asking the same question. How do we accelerate the growth of consumer revenue? Traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way, costing you money. IQ Audience Plus by Town News is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers you to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Ready to supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income? Visit townnews.com/EP today to learn more about IQ Audience Plus by Town News.
Okay, Steve, I'm looking at the press release now, and you list some amazing organizations. For example, Lion, for one, local independent online news publishers, very anti-JCPA. For those of you that don't know what the JCPA is, if this is your first touching of this issue, it's called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. It was a thing that Amy Klobuchar was championing. We at E&P, if you look it up, we're way behind it. I mean, one of the reasons Jennifer Bertetto of Trib Live became our Publisher of the Year was that amazing speech she did in front of the Senate committee, trying to urge for supporting local journalism. Lion was against it. They were just as vocal as News Media Alliance and America's newspapers who were for it. But as I look at this list now, I know that the National Newspaper Association, which is part of your coalition, was in favor of the JCPA. You've got the LMC in here, but you've got a lot of state associations that I've spoken at their conferences that are now joining your group. You've got the National Association of Hispanic Publications. You've got the Alternative News Media in there, but some are blatantly not in there. So I wanted to first ask you, why isn't the News Media Alliance part of your group? Why isn't America's Newspapers part of your group? Why isn't the National Association of Broadcasters part of the group, if you don't mind? I don't want to make this a gotcha question, but they lobby. I mean, the News Media Alliance has, Jennifer, Danielle Coffey, one of the top lobbyists that at least we talk to all the time. Why are they not part of your organization?
Well, we decided to initially have the organization have a little bit of its gravitational center in representing medium and small size players.
Okay.
And that's because we felt like, the larger players had really strong representation. And our initial task was to kind of gather together the folks in the medium and small size sector to pull them together. And then we worked quite closely with especially NAB and America's Newspapers around the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. And so we basically meet all the time with all those players that you said. So there's not to get too complicated about it, but there's the coalition, and then there's another coalition of, those groups that aren't, all in the same group, but on particular issues, we were working well together. And for instance, it was really quite encouraging and exciting how closely we worked with the broadcasters on the payroll tax credit. Well, we were really working hand in glove on that. And again, we end up, mostly working together on lots of things, but the one that there wasn't a consensus around was the JCPA. But on other things, we have been working with them. Same actually with NPR. NPR has, limits on lobbying and things like that. So they don't like to join coalitions of certain sorts, but we worked with them as well on some of these things.
For those of you that don't know what the Local Journalism Sustainability Act is, I talk about that as Francis Wick's Jerry Maguire moment. Francis Wick is that's how we had him on this program when he woke up one morning and said, what if there was a tax credit? What if there were 3 tax credits? You give a credit to the human being that subscribes to local journalism, give a credit to the advertiser that supports it, and give a credit to the guy that's paying the journalist. I mean, and go for 3, and we wound up with 1, right? As it started to whittle down, the one that seemed most able to possibly go through Congress was a credit to the person who pays the journalist, a local journalist, correct? And you got pretty
Yes,
damn
but
close with that.
the
That's
other
still
two,
percolating.
but the other two are percolating on the state level. So I thought Francis's formulation was brilliant. I think that just the simplicity of it, I mean, it's complex actually sometimes in how you implement it, but the simplicity of the principle is really smart and compelling. You know, you're helping, for one thing, you don't have, it's a substantial form of help, but you don't have a government agency sitting around the table giving out grants to news organizations they find worthy. You know, through the tax credit approach, you sidestep some very real First Amendment issues. You solve those, and you're in the case of the credit for the consumer to buy a subscription, or we got them to add buy a subscription or make a donation to a local nonprofit news organization. You're just empowering and you're enhancing the buying power of the consumer. You're not telling them who to subscribe to. The local news organization still has to be good. You know, they still have to be doing a good service, or else they're not going to get a subscription. In the case of the tax credit for the small businesses that advertise with local news, it's a powerful incentive. But again, the small business still is putting some of their own money in too, so they still have to decide that it's a good news organization and that they're going to reach the right type of, you know, readers. So there's a market element to it. It's not a top-down government deciding who to get what approach. And then the payroll tax credit, the reason as it kind of like worked its way through the process, you know, the practical reality was around cost, and the congressional allies basically said, look, you're not going to get all three of these. It's too expensive to do all three. So pick which one you think is the most important. And we surveyed really everyone in the coalition, and everyone pretty much agreed that the payroll tax credit was the most direct form of help, that was going to really, especially as a short-term, you know, help avert catastrophe kind of measure. It was the way of getting support in there right away. And I liked it because it also got right to the point that I think is the crux of the local news crisis, which is not enough local reporters. Like, to me,
which is where Report for America has excelled. While we've, you know, E&P's been way behind RFA, we actually cover stuff, because what an amazing thing you guys do.
I'm incredibly grateful for that. And it's the same spirit. Like, I think at the end of the day, with technology being what it is, used to be you could judge whether or not a community was served by counting the number of outlets, you know, how many newspapers there were. But that's really hard to get a measure that way. Like, you can have outlets that have no reporters, and you're not really getting anything. Which
is what's happening right now, right?
We know that. Right. You know, this new in addition to news deserts, we've been given a new phrase called ghost newspapers, to try to get at this other phenomenon of, you know, publications or entities that exist. They're printing stuff, but they're not really covering their communities very well because their reporting staffs are so short. Now, I understand that ultimately it comes back to the business models, but the reason we care about the business models is the presence of reporting in a community.
How is Rebuild Local News Coalition going to coordinate this? How large are you building your organization? How are you going to keep everybody chatting with each other with an exchange of ideas? I mean, I see a few states have joined you, at least on the newspaper association side: Mississippi, Wisconsin, Kansas, Maryland, New York, Colorado, which is an amazing state. They're incubating a lot of stuff in Colorado. Even Maine, my home state. You have a lot of them. Are you going to have like a way where this becomes the perfect incubation organization, where once one guy incubates it, the other guy can grab it? Is that your plan?
Exactly. That's the idea on the state level. So we're going to create ways for all of these people to talk to each other and pollinate. And because a lot of times we'll get calls about, hey, we want to do something you know, about a tax credit for small businesses. And we'll say, hey, did you know that Wisconsin and Colorado also already have legislation doing that? It's like,
there you go, replicate it.
So we're here, and we're getting all those folks together. We're going to literally create model laws. We're going to create proposals. We're going to sort of take the best of what's out there and our understanding of what the pitfalls are and what the right way to do it, and create model laws for the payroll tax credit and the subscription credit and the government advertising piece and the fellowships and the replanting, which is this idea we've talked about in the past of helping community groups or local businesses to acquire newspapers from chains, if that makes sense. So we're going to take these different ideas, sharpen them, and kind of cross-pollinate, get everyone talking to each other and circulating this information. And that's going to be a key part of what we do. And then in addition to that, and this will depend honestly on how much money we raise. We're raising money from foundations and stuff like that. But we're going to do, in addition to that kind of model bill strategy and convening strategy, we will also do deep dives in 3 to 5 states this year, where we're going to go in and really stand side by side with either the State Press Association or whoever in that state is interested in taking action. And so part of what's happened is folks that were disappointed that the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, that's the one with the 3 tax credits, didn't pass. It got incredibly close, by the way.
Very close.
Incredibly close. Passed the House of Representatives, came within 2 votes in the Senate. So there was real support for it. But the people in different state legislatures and state press associations, things like that, so, well, if you're not going to do it in DC, why don't we do it here? And bills that were introduced in New York and Colorado and Wisconsin and other places to take different pieces of that. And we're seeing that spread. And there's a few other things that we're seeing as well. Different ideas, the old laboratories of democracy phrase is really true. We're seeing different groups and people in the states trying different things. So another thing is the idea of maybe we should either encourage or require some of what the governments already spend in advertising for themselves, for their own purposes. Why don't we make sure some of that goes to local news? And increasingly so much advertising goes to social media. I'll even put a finer point on it. Shouldn't half of that money go to local news instead of social media? And
especially since it's my money, it's my tax money.
Yeah, and it's why not kill 2 birds? You have the value that you're getting of the marketing messaging that they're getting out there, but you can simultaneously help democracy in your communities by helping local news. And that has the advantage. I think part of why it's appealing is it doesn't involve new spending. It's just taking the money that's already being spent and spending it in a way that can actually help communities. So that's another example. California and New Mexico have passed legislation to provide fellowships through the journalism schools to put more reporters into local newsrooms. Wisconsin is looking at a tax credit for small businesses that advertise with local news.
How do you avoid, when you say things like nonprofit, and you say how do you avoid the thought or the perception that that's going to lean left politically? I mean, let's be blatantly honest. As much as public radio and public broadcasting screams that we are diverse, and we've had their new news anchors on this program, and we've supported public broadcasting, their demography of their audience is not. It's very left and it's very white, and they're fighting that right now. How do you make sure that as you push through this legislation, that you're not perceived, especially with you, sir, because I in your Wikipedia page, it says that you've been on MSNBC so many times that you have your own private green room now, and they've named the guest chair the Waldman chair.
No, that's not true. I was a Fox employee. I sold my company, BeliefNet, to Fox. I still have my Fox business card. So I deny the charges. But your question is a really smart and important one, because I think that's the reality. I've said that,
it's perception is reality. We're going back to it.
Well, look, it cuts both ways. I mean, we have newspapers that are, weeklies in Oklahoma that probably lean right. And so in the sense, if any given publication is perceived as leaning one way or another, that's fine. That's the diversity of America. What you want to do is have the collective be broad and diverse. My kind of gold standard for public policy is the postal subsidy, which was, put out there in the Post Office Act of 1792, and then continued on for another 100 years. But it was first of all, for people who are worried that you can't have government support without violating the First Amendment, the person who literally wrote the First Amendment, James Madison, supported having a subsidy for newspapers. So James Madison thought it was okay for the First Amendment that he wrote to have some support for newspapers. And that was in the form of the postal subsidy. Now, I'm not saying we should all be pouring all of our efforts into postal subsidies, right, but there's some principles that they had there, right? It was content neutral. There was not a board sitting around deciding what was valid. And in fact, some horribly scurrilous newspapers benefited from the postal subsidy. And the Jeffersonian papers benefited, and the Federalist papers benefited, and they were all angry at each other. And
but that's what it's about. That's okay.
That's what it's about. And and the two different factions agreed on the postal subsidy. They were as viciously opposed to each other as the parties are now. And they agreed on this because they understood that you couldn't have a healthy democracy without a newspaper industry. And the other thing about that was it was based on a kind of, and this may be hard to replicate, but it was based on a sort of simple standard. It was just distance traveled, right? It was, if the newspaper was traveling X amount, it was 1 penny. If it was traveling farther than that, it was 1.5 pennies. And that was it. And it didn't get into a lot of fine tuning. Now but you have to be willing to accept the muddiness of that if you're a Jeffersonian, that means some of those damn Federalist papers that are full of lies are going to get the postal subsidy. And that's the nature of, anything like this. And by the way, it's also the nature of something like the charitable deduction, right? Like, you as a taxpayer are subsidizing all of my ridiculous charity choices, and vice versa.
I get a tax.
Because we both get charitable deductions, right? So
and we strive for that.
We all have to have a basic premise that democracy requires a healthy local press.
Well, how about broadcast? I mean, back in the days when the only way to get news after print was broadcast, you had to lease spectrum and prove to the federal government that you were giving back to the community in exchange for that piece of the spectrum. That's originally news. I mean, news was a pain in the ass for the networks. They called it a public trust. I mean, they didn't start monetizing until they realized we could start going in a different direction. Anyway, this is exciting stuff. Thanks to your funding from the Knight Foundation, Ford Foundation, Microsoft, a handful of others, the Rebuild Local News Coalition. The big headline is, it is now you're cooking with gas. You are officially now a new, how should I say that? Nonpartisan public policies, nonprofit organization working towards the common good. I guess not just for news publishers, but news media in general, and working with local and state and national organizations. You kind of, if I use the metaphor, you've herded the cats, right? You're bringing in all the players and just trying to make sure we all work together better, which is a great cause. Stephen Waldman, thank you. Your time we know is valuable here at ENP. We're behind you 100%.
Always here for ENP. As I said, I am a religious reader of ENP. I am every day I open the newsletter, and it's almost annoying how many different pieces I feel like I want to and need to read. It would be much easier if you only had one piece per issue that was interesting, but almost everything you've got in there is really valuable and interesting.
So thank you. I appreciate the compliment, sir. You're saying there's more of a possibility on a state level now. And
Yeah.
is this why you're doing?
Just to make the general point, like, why don't we focus on what we agree on? Like, there's plenty of ways of helping the news industry. Why don't we focus?
We agree that a journalist's salary is something that is different than paying a guy at a car wash to wash a car. In other words, if you're paying someone to be that final check on power, as our republic dictates, then there should be some way that that salary is treated differently than the salary of another worker, correct? And as long as there's no government intervention. So whether it's state or national, here comes the next question, which I always pose when we discuss this. How do you define journalism?
There's the how do you define journalism and how do you define local were the two toughest questions when you're writing law.
Exactly.
And, there are definitions that have built up over, work on shield laws and things like that we piggybacked on too. We sort of decided, rather than coming up with our own new definition, we worked with the definitions that have been sort of tried and tested in the courts and in other legislative bodies. And, the way we also did it was someone described to me like what they called a Swiss cheese approach to legislating, which is you have different layers to it. So in the case of what's a journalist, we actually defined both what's a news organization as well as what's a journalist. So and that's in some ways is easier. And in terms of what is local, for our purposes, we kind of said it's within a state. It's something that is covering a geographic area, a community, a set of communities, or a state. Now that's a little bit of an arbitrary line. You could say, well, what about a region? What about a region of the country or a collection of states? But you have to draw the line somewhere.
Or a specific demography. I
mean, it's really the case when you're dealing with legislation that you're always going to be better off if you're not, concocting new theories and definitions about things, but working with existing rules and structures like, municipal governments or states.
Are you entertaining ideas like the Journalism Trust Institute is doing, or the auditing systems that are now starting to incubate around, where we self-monitor and we self-accept our own? In other words, we have our own set of standards that can be audited and posted. Because we both know that if government intervenes, then we have a problem. I mean, we're one of those few societies where government, even in Canada, news is influenced by the government, but here it's not.
It's as you said, we've never had that here. We've never had a kind of accreditation system for journalists.
No.
It would make public policy easier if there were some kind of self-accrediting body, because then the government wouldn't have to get into that business. You could rely on the accreditation or the stamp of approval of the entity. But there are risks to that. It's not the government excluding people, but the accrediting body can exclude organizations, and some may figure that they're not part of that. So none of these systems are perfect, but the way that the LJSA was set up, the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, and let's just take the payroll tax credit part, was there were just a set of different criteria, and they tried to make them as kind of objective and measurable and not subjective as possible. Are you publishing news about a community? Do you have at least one full-time local reporter who lives in the area?
It was almost like a set of tests you had to go through and check the boxes. And as the boxes got checked,
and none of the boxes were, do you do good journalism, or do you do journalism that's civically important? Like, that's way too subjective. Even though, if you were a philanthropist personally, you might want to do that, right? You might want to only do towards things that are, But as government policy, you can't and shouldn't do that.
You can't do that
have,
because, and you just can't get involved in what. Okay, that brings up the final topic I wanted to bring up to you. How do you avoid, when you say things like nonprofit, and you say things, how do you avoid the thought or the perception that that's going to lean left politically? I mean, let's be blatantly honest. As much as public radio and public broadcasting screams that we are diverse, and we've had their new news anchors on this program, and we've supported, public broadcasting, their demography of their audience is not. It's very left and it's very white, and they're fighting that right now. How do you make sure that as you push through this legislation, that you're not perceived, especially with you, sir, because I in your Wikipedia page, it says that you've been on MSNBC so many times that you have your own private green room now, and they've named the guest chair the Waldman chair.
No, right? That's not true. I was a Fox employee. I sold my company, BeliefNet, to Fox. I still have my Fox business card. So I deny the charges. But your question is a really smart and important one, because I think that's the reality. I've said that,
it's perception is reality. We're going back to it.
Well, look, it cuts both ways. I mean, we have newspapers that are, weeklies in Oklahoma that probably lean right. And so in the sense, if any given publication is perceived as leaning one way or another, that's fine. That's the diversity of America. What you want to do is have the collective be broad and diverse. Like, my kind of gold standard for public policy is the postal subsidy, which was, put out there in the Post Office Act of 1792, and then continued on for another 100 years. But, it was, first of all, for people who are worried that you can't have government support without violating the First Amendment, the person who literally wrote the First Amendment, James Madison, supported having a subsidy for newspapers. So James Madison thought it was okay for the First Amendment that he wrote to have some support for newspapers. And that was in the form of the postal subsidy. Now, I'm not saying we should all be pouring all of our efforts into postal subsidies, right, but there's some principles that they had there, right? It was content neutral. There was not a board sitting around deciding what was valid. And in fact, some horribly scurrilous newspapers benefited from the postal subsidy. And the Jeffersonian papers benefited, and the Federalist papers benefited, and they were all angry at each other. And
but that's what it's about. That's okay.
That's what it's about. And and the two different factions agreed on the postal subsidy. They were as viciously opposed to each other as the parties are now. And they agreed on this because they understood that you couldn't have a healthy democracy without a newspaper industry. And the other thing about that was it was based on a kind of, and this may be hard to replicate, but it was based on a sort of simple standard. It was just distance traveled, right? It was, if the newspaper was traveling X amount, it was 1 penny. If it was traveling farther than that, it was 1.5 pennies, and that was it. And it didn't get into a lot of fine tuning. Now but you have to be willing to accept the muddiness of that. That if you're a Jeffersonian, that means some of those damn Federalist papers that are full of lies are going to get the postal subsidy. And that's the nature of, anything like this. And by the way, it's also the nature of something like the charitable deduction, right? Like, you as a taxpayer are subsidizing all of my ridiculous charity choices, and vice versa.
I get a tax.
Because we both get charitable deductions, right? So we all have to have a basic premise that democracy requires a healthy local press.
Well, how about broadcast? I mean, when back in the days when the only way to get news after print was broadcast, you had to lease spectrum and prove to the federal government that you were giving back to the community in exchange for that piece of the spectrum. That's originally news. I mean, news was a pain in the ass for the networks. They called it a public trust. I mean, they didn't start monetizing until they realized we could start going in a different direction. When I ran radio groups, we used to have the Sunday morning God tapes, we called it, where we were constantly putting in our public file that we were running all this public service stuff on Sundays to prove that we deserved our spectrum. That in no way said my news was left versus right. It was simply
right.
Well,
and I didn't answer a question that you asked earlier, and I want to get back to it, which was what's happening on the state level, state and local level.
Go ahead. Anyway, this is exciting stuff. Thanks to your funding from the Knight Foundation, Ford Foundation, Microsoft, a handful of others, the Rebuild Local News Coalition. The big headline is, it is now, well, now you're cooking with gas. You are officially now a new, how should I say, the nonpartisan public policies, a nonprofit organization working towards the common good, I guess, not just for news publishers, but news media in general, and working with local and state and national organizations. You kind of, if I use the metaphor, you've herded the cats, right? You're bringing in all the players and just trying to make sure we all work together better, which is a great cause. Stephen Waldman, thank you. Your time, we know, is valuable here at ENP. We're behind you 100%.
Always here for ENP. As I said, I am a religious reader of ENP. I am every day I open the newsletter, and it's almost annoying how many different pieces I feel like I want to and need to read. It would be much easier if you only had one piece per issue that was interesting, but almost everything you've got in there is really valuable and interesting. And both, like, what I know from having been in this line of work too, there's always, it's hard to strike the balance between stuff that's utilitarian, actionable, practical information, and stuff that's thought-provoking. And you do both, on a daily basis. I'm very impressed and appreciative of the mix and the breadth of the content, and that you continue to evolve, to incorporate new types of media and innovation. And
it's a tough game, because remember, especially now with labor unions, we just put out a major piece on that there's two sides to that coin, as you likely know, and we got to serve both sides of that. So like you, we're always making sure that we're putting out the right messaging, but in all different, to serve the common and not just be in one straightforward mission. So thank you. I appreciate the compliment, sir.
My pleasure.
We're done, I guess.
Talking with you again.
Well, we're going to do a little editing on that, I'm sure. What did you think? It's funny. We had Peter Lawfer on our program. I don't know if you know him. He is the professor of journalism in Oregon. He wrote the book Slow News, if that will prod your memory, first published in Italian. But he held the paper of record for, the capital, Eugene, Oregon, in his hand. And he said he's approached Gannett about donating the paper to the university so the students can run it, because he held the current issue and he right on this program, and he said there is one local story in the A section, one local story in the B section. That's the whole damn paper. And he crumbled it up and he said, this is ridiculous. So he was screaming, this is a ghost newspaper. Right. Give it to us and we can revise the brand. So this is my next question to you. And I ask this of all people who are trying to sustain local journalism. Because remember, Ken Doctor has been on this program many times. I'm sure you're familiar with his new startup, which is doing exceptionally well out in Santa Cruz. When I screamed at him, here you go, you've been in our industry for decades, and now you start away from the traditional legacy brand. My question is, how valuable are those brands today? Do you look at them first when you're thinking of what you're doing, or do you just, if they're there, they're there, they'll be part of our help. If they ain't, they ain't. I mean, Jeff Jarvis on this very program actually said, it's natural selection, let them die. It doesn't matter anymore. Where are you on those brands? Because remember, look at me. I took over a 140-year-old brand that was languishing and put some life back into it. Aren't they worth saving? Should we be focusing?
I think so. I mean, I tend to be more in the camp of that these brands often have significant value. And I think that partially because this nonprofit that I did with Report for America was my first nonprofit. I'd done for-profit startups. And I know from my own experience that the hardest thing we had to do was build a brand from scratch. It's really hard to overstate how important a brand that's built up over many decades is. That can be an incredibly valuable thing. And I think startups don't always understand the value of that brand. Now, it is true that in some communities, the people running these papers have been busily destroying the brand's value, in recent years. And in those cases, the brand may not have much value. But if you look at the numbers of this, I am a big supporter of nonprofit media. I think that part of the sector definitely needs to grow. But, the entire membership of the Institute for Nonprofit News, including both the nationals and the locals, is about 400.
Right.
There's about 7,000 or 8,000 newspapers.
Still left. People forget that. They're still left. There's community papers. There's weekly.
Even if you just dramatically said, half of those have been gutted so much that
they're gone.
They're gone. It's too late to save the patient.
You've got 3,500 left.
Right.
Powerful brands with people opening their emails and sharing their social media content.
Yes. So I basically think it's really misguided to think that we're going to solve the local news crisis without a strategy for strengthening commercial media.
Thank you.
And local brands. Now, I think.
Thank you. Because
I really believe that.
It's one or the other.
And this is also part of why I did Rebuild Local. Because Report for America straddled both worlds, we were placing reporters in both for-profit newsrooms and nonprofit news. And I can tell you absolute confidence that the quality of the journalism and the public service mission of the for-profit partners was just as good as the public service mission of the nonprofit partners. They just were. And I saw there's thousands of really, really important, strong commercial local news properties out there. Now, I do think that it is incumbent on people in the commercial sector to also be honest about the various toxins in the commercial sector that are creating ghost newspapers and news deserts and things like that, because it has pointed me toward, we use the phrase Rebuild Local, community grounded newspapers, which is kind of a euphemism. We didn't want to quite say locally owned, because there are plenty of chain newspapers that are very good. But the reality is that the consolidation of the news industry under hedge funds and private equity firms has really had a negative impact.
There's no question.
I think there's really strong evidence for that.
Well, I'm looking at the talking points that Lion put out against the JCPA. And I wanted to bounce these off of you because Lion is part of your organization. And I like Lion. I just think that Lion's mission has pushed very nonprofit-y. They're constantly talking nonprofit, 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 where the for-profit guys don't feel like they can be part of that organization. This is where, at least that's my perception of what we see in some of the messaging we get. But here's one of the talking points. The Mike Reeds of the world see JCPA as a payday. It's right there. The messaging, let me say that again. So in other words, you started off by saying our organization is not, we want to work more with the local guys. We don't want to work with the Mike Reeds of the world. Am I kind of, is it one or the other is my question, where
I'm happy to work with Mike Reed to help pass the Local Journalism Sustainability Act.
Okay. There it is.
And anything else where we have common ground.
Okay. But again, when you look at what happened in Australia, when they did safe harbor legislation, if you want to call that, which is what the JCPA was kind of, a collective bargaining, whatever you call it, like a baseball team. The person who got the most out of it was Rupert Murdoch, correct? And that's what people circle back to. It wasn't perfect legislation. My question to you is, our founding fathers knew that we were one of the toughest governments to ever build, because it had to be built on consensus and it had to be built on compromise. Even in the Federalist, I mean, James Madison wrote, it's all about compromise, compromise, compromise. It's half a loaf. No legislation is perfect. Wouldn't the JCPA have done something at least would have pushed us in the right direction? Or were we just it had to be perfect from the start? This is where
look, you're trying to get me to move out of my Switzerland position of neutrality on the JCPA. I have opinions on this, but I'll say this, look, because I'm not gonna get into what the point is at which it could be, or how I would have voted if I were a congressman.
Exactly.
But we should be honest about a few things. The JCPA is not a helping local journalism bill. It's helping media bill. I suspect that most of the money actually would have gone to national media, not local media. And even though it was sold as primarily a local media thing, I don't think that's necessarily a killer strike against the bill. Like, as I said, we had this issue even with the payroll tax credit. Some of the folks from smaller publications would say, but most of the benefit's going to go to Gannett, which was true. They have more reporters than anyone else. And I said, focus on what this is going to do for you. Focus on whether this is going to help your community. And if it does, what do you care whether Gannett gets some, So that's, my general philosophy about legislative tactics. But I will say that I think there were legitimate questions raised about how to strengthen JCPA and make it more likely to help local news. That strengthened the bill over time. The transparency provisions got better. In the House bill, there was a provision that would have tied more of it to the spending on actual local news. I don't think there's anything wrong with pushing for it to get more in that direction. And the final bill that they had actually excluded the nonprofit industry. It excluded any nonprofit news, which is kind of crazy, right? Like, so you're in Texas and the Dallas Morning News would be able to benefit from JCPA, but Texas Tribune wouldn't. What's the rationale there? I still think you can make isn't it still better than nothing argument, but you do get to a point where, it's maybe less so with JCPA, but you have an issue where if you are giving, in effect, a large amount of money to Alden Capital, say, and we know what they've done with their capital in the past, that there is some risk that they're going to use that money to, to do bad things. I think there's still, sort of an argument on the other side that, like, yeah, but you're still better off.
But still, the Francis Wicks of the world and the Mark Adams of the world, who are larger companies, who care about local, they would use the money towards continuing their family missions.
Right.
But let's put that aside now, because let's talk about the future, because we only have, the JCPA may or may not come back. Right now, we're looking at what I'm hearing is tax credits, and you just reaffirmed that, are definitely still a possibility on a national level.